nailing it down. And today we're in our intellectual self-defense series. Now, this has been riled up by both spending too much time watching Twitter and Facebook, and particularly claims that, for example, Capitals Volume 1 through 4 explain everything, including what happens on Twitter, which I find to be a somewhat ludicrous proposition, even if I do think that the fundamental dynamics that Marx describes in Capitals Volume 1 through 3 and Theories of Surplus Value, aka Capital Volume 4, do actually undergird the basis of of commodity exchange and also the way rents can be used as a form of power. While that may be true, the debates around the exact dynamics often end up being both hyper-specific and supposedly clarifying to contemporary debates in ways that I find both frustrating and not actually in the text. But it's also the case that a lot of this is frankly meaningless, that what is being discussed, such as whether or not value in Marxism is equal to value in some other generic definitional sense, as was often common in, for example, post-Marxist and post-structuralist debates, is actually an equivocation fallacy. That the definition of value in one case does not actually apply to the definition of the other, and just by the fact they are represented by the same signifier, by the same word or symbol, does not actually indicate that they are the same thing, or even analogous to the same thing, although often they are in some indirect everyday language way. I've been reading the works of Raymond Tallis and Christopher Lasch a lot lately, two thinkers that tried to write clearly, and Tallis is still alive, and while broadly on the labor left, he's often considered a more conservative critic of critical theory, while, fighting to maintain a national healthcare service in the UK and complaining about bad government. And I've been thinking about the amount of ways in which the prestidigitation of language and the misapplication of categories lead to bad thinking. Very bad thinking, often, indeed. And then there's also a corollary problem, which is a problem of non-cognitivism. And I will get back to that in a minute. I will even talk about the problems with the concept of non-cognitivism when it comes to, say, emotive or aesthetic forms of value. But if we take a kind of rigorous stance towards words, we start to see that many of our confusions, our debates, our semantic squabbles are, frankly, not particularly illuminating very quickly. Now, I have commented many times that the debates on the internet, both in the broad political spectrum and on the political left, have roughly been analogous to each other for 20 years and not quite been the same, but many of the same debates come up over and over again. The planning problems, what is the nature of the Soviet Union, how do we deal with this or that political conflict that looks like this or that past political conflict? Can we just mirror replicate the Bolsheviks or the Wobblies or some anarchist movement in Spain? And these debates happen continuously, and despite the fact of nearly infinite information being available, although much of it now curtailed behind paywalls, which you can get around, but at some risk, it becomes clear that we have not gotten any smarter in these debates. And in many ways, the forms in which we are having these debates have caused them to degenerate and become worse. One does not have to look at how many podcasts start off interesting and then become totally captured by discourse patterns that degrade them very quickly to see this trend, even though the same discussions will be had. And in fact, many thinkers that I once liked who had very clear positions on something, as they approached knowledge of it and their positions became more complex, but their need to maintain an audience grew, they moved away from any conceptual clarity into whatever debate of the day. And we've seen this on the intellectual dark web and the way that kind of tailed right-wing talking points. We've seen this in and streamer and online movements that are hard to tell how real they are, such as, quote, MAGA communism, patriotic socialism, or mega communism. We've seen this in many, many different fields of left media and left debate culture. And increasingly, tribal positions, aka positions attached to one's sense of identity and attached to one's sense of self, and thus, if we apply a little terror management theory, thus becoming fundamental to our identity, become non-cognitive, meaning that we have to defend them because we are defending our own justification for our self-narrative. This is a universal problem. This is not unique to leftists. It's not unique to me or you. The issue here, though, is that when you mix that with a tendency to use words sloppily with character limits and attention spans that are highly delimited, or maybe not even delimited, just flat out fucking limited, you can see very quickly why these debates would degenerate. So there's three things here that can help you, and you can also take them to all kinds of problematic places. Recently, there was a long discussion on my Patreon about the idea of redeeming the past, which is something that I said you can't do. Now, I said it in a context of a poetry book that I've written on liberation, which plays with different ideas of redemption. Now, as a poet, you'd think I would be pro-conceptual uses of language, but because I deal in that all the time and deal in metaphor and analogous thinking, and both analogous thinking in the philosophical sense, i.e., we see the world, we pick up concepts analogous to what works in the world, and if they help us socially reproduce our way of life and each other, I mean, literally, like we have human babies, we will adopt those ideas. This kind of Marxist idea of the emergence or reification from the concrete to the abstract back into the concrete are, to talk in modern systems theory terms, why social systems have feedback loops. Right. Now, I talk about this all the time. It shows up in many upcoming episodes of Just the Straight Varn blog, and that's a part of many interviews. And as I continuously do more interviews on radicalizing our understandings of policy or on understanding science, which is something that I'm increasingly returning to an interest in, we will see how these kind of issues come into play. And what I mean here, all right, is we need a little bit of anti-rhetoric. We need to distrust a lot of our notions. There's a lot being weighed on the idea of redemption, all right, which is a fundamentally debt-driven, almost religious, emotive concept. Now, no concept is purely emotive, and this is one of my issues with non-cognitivism, and I will define that for you in a minute. It is not just our emotions, but our prior experiences, our logics, our heuristics, which inform our emotions. So something that's non-cognitive does not mean that it is entirely unreasonable. You might have good causal reasons for believing something non-cognitively. All right, our psychological reasons for believing something non-cognitive that play into any logical construction that you make. And the hard distinction between logic and emotions here is kind of an artificial one, but it's instrumentally useful. What we can see here is a lot of the pushback I got on redemption is if we can't redeem the past, we also can't redeem the future. And we can't redeem the present, and thus where's the room for hope? And I've said hope is not a cognitive category; it is an orientation. Now, there's all kinds of kind of folk psychology we can go in about the need for hope. All right, we might go into real psychology about it too. But when I'm talking about how we should think about the past, the future, and how we should orient ourselves, the idea that we do it to redeem, quote unquote, make the bad things that happened in the past, or even the bad things happening now, worth it in some exchange way, is an analogous concept. It is not in any meaningful sense real. In many ways, it is what Gilbert Ryle would call a category mistake, or what is often called now in analytic philosophy, a category error. Now, Rao, who came up with this in the concept of mind in 1949, was arguing against Cartesian metaphysics. Ryle argued that it was a mistake to treat the mind as an object made of an immaterial substance because the predictions of substance are not meaningful for a collection of dispositions, capacities, and reflections, meaning that we treat an experience as an object, and thus assuming that because an experience is an object, it must have the same qualities of a prior object. This is a logical deduction in some ways, but it's a category mistake because we are assuming that experience and object are the same thing. And that's a problem with talking about something like redemption, because our notions of what is justifiable are always slippery and moving around. They are not entirely cognitive. They're hard to define, which is why we always try to nail a definition down. Now, you can nail a definition down in two ways. You can test it analytically, which is to state your definition and try to prove it through axioms, through empirical data, through the intersection of both in scientific methods, or you can try to prove it dialectically, both in the historical dialectical sense, which is in an oppositional debate, where the debate is about the nature of the category, and thus definitions emerge from the debate, or in Hegelian dialectics, they emerge as an emanation of the absolute idea. This is why Hegel is an idealist, by the way. I mean, literally, he thinks that an idea, which is a manifestation of the negativity of God, is what drives history, right? Marxism flips that on its head, and we say that all the time. It becomes a rhetorical trope, but here's what we mean by it. That no, for us, ideas emerge from the material world. Our mind sees them, we recognize them, and we find them socially useful. All right. It is not entirely a pragmatic notion, because it does assume that there are analogous things to these concepts. All right. Commodities exist because things exist. Things exist and have use values. Therefore, commodities exist for exchange value, and that leads to value or abstract value through abstract labor. All right. That's the Marxist logic for that. Now, you may take issue with that or not. Okay. Value in Marxism does not equal one-to-one price, although there are good arguments from the physiocrats that it might equal an aggregate price because of emergent qualities of ideas. You hear this argued in the econophysics adjacent schools of Marxism. And if you want to know what that is, I can do an explainer on it. But what we have here with redemption is a non-cognitive thing. Anything that you invest that much of your identity is going to have these non-cognitive traits. Now, the critique of non-cognitivism, just say something is non-cognitive and thus not rational and dismiss it, is actually a problem, because, like I said, heuristics tend to come out of something real, and our emotions tend to operate heuristically. All right? So what does that mean? Well, it means that when we deal with something heuristically, we think, I disapprove of killing, as A.J. Archer argued back in the day of the early Vienna Circle with the early positivists, that killing is wrong should really be stated as killing gross, or I disapprove of killing. Killing boo. But what we can actually deduce from that is like killing boo because of these prior experiences, kinds of intersubjective empathy, etc. So it's not that the emotivism is a problem inherently. It's just we need to be aware that that's what's driving our commitment to particular words. And because of things like pareidolia is a tendency to see patterns that aren't there, particularly if they're symbolically represented together in some way. The human mind is incredibly good at pattern recognition. It's also incredibly bad at it. In fact, we over-recognize. There's an analogy here to things that we've learned from comparative primate studies. I know David Graeber would be mad that I'm talking about comparative primate studies, but I'm talking about modern humans here. And by modern humans, I mean people alive right now who have access to contemporary technology. One of the interesting things about pattern recognition between us and our primate cousins is that the other great apes, when given a pattern that has a lot of useless steps, they will repeat the useless steps until they can figure out if they're useful or not and drop them. Humans tend to repeat the useless steps regardless, because we assume that any pattern must have meaning. That's why it's being passed down. That has been useful, I think, as you know, and this is speculative, I admit, for our cultural development, for our development to develop complex societies, etc. But it's also an inhibitor, because we will make meaning where none exists. We are the best at fooling ourselves. And when people play with that, with words or concepts or ideas we identify with, or with people we identify with, or with name dropping we identify with, even if what they're doing is non equivalent, we can easily fool ourselves first and fool other people later. All right. That's some basics. We're going to be returning to this because we're returning to some key ideas from the Vienna Circle. I also will be still doing nailing it down on political concepts. The biggest project, and I think will start next year as soon as I talk to Jim Badgelon and nail down a schedule and a format, will be a series of interviews, audio essays, etc., that will be labeled nailing it down on the idea and concept of the nation. All right. The different Marxist concepts, the different general concepts, the different kinds of nationalism, how they interacted, the order in which they developed in different places. We're going to be going into all that, right? So people often accuse me of not taking that question seriously, and I absolutely do. The other thing that I'll be doing is, once we start pinning that down, I'm going to be starting dealing with concepts around imperialism, which I've done before. One of my things that I talk about imperialism, people think that I deny it exists. I don't. I think it's a major problem. The problem is, though, as a word, often Marxists throw it around without defining it, and it can mean everything from competition of labor triage, of unequal and competitive advantage on the international world market, to direct colonialism, to hyper exploitation, to offsiding of excess surplus to prevent overproduction. All these theories and frameworks for how imperialism work are all mentioned in Marxism, and in quasi and proto-socialism like J.A. Hobson. But they're not the same thing, even though they use the same word. There's a debate even in the early 19th to 20th century if you can call imperialism capitalist, why it is the highest stage or not, what is going on there. And a lot of people would just like to reduce it to a problem to go away. I, however, just saying we need to clarify what we mean by it, because we're not talking about the same thing a lot of the time, which is why we don't really understand each other on the left. It's also why we can't come up with either a research program to truly understand it or a political program to deal with it, because we're not talking about the same thing, which is why this is important. And with that, I hope you start to nail it down. Have a great day.